Somewhere in the Judean desert, in caves overlooking the lowest point on earth, scholars found fragments of text that mention Eden. Not the Eden you're picturing, not apple trees and talking snakes. These fragments talk about Eden like it's a coordinate, a direction, a place you travel toward, cross borders to reach, measure distance from. That's strange, right? Because for thousands of years we've been taught Eden was a garden. Lush, green, self-contained, a single spot on a map you could theoretically walk into if you just knew where to look. But the Dead Sea Scrolls don't talk about Eden like that. They talk about it the way you talk about a river's source, or a mountain pass, or a border crossing between kingdoms. Geography language, map language, and once you notice it, you can't unsee it. If you're listening to this while falling asleep, that's exactly why I make these. So do me a favour, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is right now. I love checking these in the morning. It's wild seeing Tokyo at sunrise, London at midnight, some guy in Ohio still awake at 3 a.m. because he can't stop thinking about ancient deserts. It's a strange little community we've built here across every time zone on Earth. Now, before we go further, if you're on Spotify, follow the show there. It's ad-free, music-free, just the story straight through, perfect for actually falling asleep without getting jolted awake by a commercial. And if any of this has helped you sleep, or just made you think differently about texts you thought you already knew, a 5-star review helps more than you'd guess. Links in the description. Okay, back to the desert. Here's what we're actually going to do tonight. We're not going to tell you what Eden definitively was. Nobody can do that honestly, and anyone who claims certainty is selling you something. Instead, we're going to follow clues, real ones, sitting in scroll fragments and biblical texts for over 2,000 years, mostly ignored because everyone assumed Eden was botany, not geography. We're going to trace this from the scrolls themselves, back through Genesis and its 4 mysterious rivers, into Ezekiel's strange mountain temple imagery, out into the actual physical landscape the Qumran community lived in, cliffs, wilderness, a dead, salt-choked sea sitting right there in their backyard, like some kind of grim geographical warning sign. And along the way we're going to ask questions that rarely get asked together. Why does Eden get described with directional language, eastward, upward, outward, like someone's giving travel instructions? Why do precious stones and specific minerals show up in the same breath as sacred geography? Why did a community living in one of the harshest, most isolated landscapes on Earth develop such intense borders and boundaries thinking about paradise? Because here's the thing, nobody connects. The people who wrote and preserved these scrolls weren't abstract theologians floating in the clouds. They were desert dwellers, border people. They thought in terms of routes, water sources, elevation and territory, because that's what survival demanded from them every single day. And that mindset, I think, leaked directly into how they imagined paradise itself. So stick with me. We're heading into the caves. Let's back up for a second though, because before we can chase geography clues through these scrolls, we need to understand what we're actually holding. And I mean that literally. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls aren't one document. They're not a single book somebody wrote and buried. They're closer to a shattered library, nearly 1,000 different texts. Some just a few letters clinging to a scrap of leather, others nearly complete scrolls you could unroll and read start to finish. And they fall into some pretty distinct categories, each one giving us a different kind of window into how these people thought about the world. First, you've got biblical manuscripts, copies of Genesis, Isaiah, Psalms, books you'd recognize from any modern Bible, but centuries older than anything we had before these caves were found. These matter because they show us the raw material, the actual wording these communities were reading and copying, sometimes with small but fascinating differences from later versions. Then you've got the sectarian rules, documents like the community rule, which basically function as constitutions, laying out how this group organized itself, who could join, what rituals they practiced, how they policed their own boundaries, literal and spiritual. These texts are obsessed with order, hierarchy, and separation. Insiders versus outsiders, pure versus impure, which hold that thought, because that obsession with boundaries doesn't stay abstract. It shows up in how they talk about land too. Next, the Pesharim. These are commentaries, basically ancient Bible study notes, where the community takes an older prophetic text and interprets it as being about their own time, their own enemies, their own future. Think of it as prophecy fan fiction, except they believed it completely. These commentaries are gold for us because they show how flexible and symbolic these people were willing to get with geography. A mountain in an old prophecy might become code for their own community. A city might represent their enemies. Nothing stays literal for long. Then there's liturgy, hymns, prayers, songs of praise, some of them describing heavenly worship happening in cosmic temples, angels singing in celestial courts. And finally, apocalyptic texts, visionary literature describing the end of the world, cosmic battles, divine judgment, and yes, often paradise itself, restored, rebuilt, waiting somewhere just beyond the horizon of history. So why does any of this matter for a video about Eden and geography? Because geography almost never shows up directly in these texts. Nobody hands you a treasure map with an X marking Eden's front gate. Instead, geography sneaks in sideways through symbols, through boundary language, through pilgrimage logic, through what I'd call prophetic mapping, describing spiritual realities using the vocabulary of physical space. Watch for it, and you'll start seeing it everywhere. A text describing ritual purity might use the language of crossing a border, moving from profane territory into sacred territory, almost like passing through a checkpoint. A hymn describing heavenly worship might describe it using the architecture of a temple, courts within courts, each one more restricted, more holy than the last. An apocalyptic vision of restored paradise might borrow directional language, east up beyond, that echoes exactly how ancient travellers described real journeys across real terrain. This is where things get delicate though, and I want to be upfront about the challenges here, because if I don't, I'm not being honest with you. These texts are fragmentary. Some scrolls survive almost complete. Others are puzzle pieces with half the picture missing, sentences that trail off mid-thought, words that could be read multiple ways depending on how a scholar reconstructs a torn edge. On top of that, we're dealing with variant readings. Different copies of the same text sometimes say slightly different things, which means scholars don't always agree on what the original wording even was. And then you've got interpretive layering, meaning later scribes, later communities, sometimes even later translators, added their own understanding on top of the original text, like sediment building up over centuries. So, when we talk about geography clues in these scrolls, we have to hold that lightly. We're not doing forensic cartography here. We're doing something closer to detective work with half the evidence missing and witnesses who don't always agree with each other. That said, some patterns really do repeat often enough, clearly enough, across multiple independent texts, that they're worth taking seriously. So let's define what actually counts as a geography clue for our purposes tonight. First, directional terms. Words like eastward, upward, beyond, which show up constantly and almost always carry symbolic weight alongside any literal meaning. Second, toponyms, actual place names, real or symbolic, rivers, mountains, cities, that anchor a text to a physical or cosmic location. Third, hydrology, meaning references to water, springs, rivers, sources, which, as we'll see later tonight, might be doing a lot more theological work than you'd expect. Fourth, trade routes, references to paths, roads, and networks of movement that reveal how these communities actually understood connection between places. And fifth, cosmological maps. The bigger structural ideas about how the universe itself is arranged, heaven above, earth below, sacred space nested inside profane space, like Russian nesting dolls. All of this brings us to the baseline question we need to carry with us for the rest of this investigation. When these texts talk about Eden, are we looking at a real place claim, some actual physical location these people believed you could theoretically travel to if you had the right map? Or are we looking at a temple map metaphor, geography borrowed purely to describe sacred architecture and ritual order? Or, and this is the possibility that I think gets ignored the most, are we looking at both at once, a real landscape and a sacred blueprint fused so completely together that the ancient mind never even saw them as separate categories the way we do? Keep that question in your back pocket, because as we move from these fragments into Genesis itself, and then into Ezekiel's bizarre mountain temple visions, that question is going to get a lot harder to answer and a lot more interesting. So let's start with the piece everybody thinks they know, Eden in Genesis. In Genesis 2, Eden looks at first glance pretty straightforward. You've got a garden planted by God. It's in Eden in the east. There are trees that are good for food, a couple of special trees with narrative jobs to do, and then this line that seems simple until you slow down and actually read it. A river goes out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it parts and becomes 4 headwaters. That little sentence is doing ridiculous amounts of work. Notice the flow. The river doesn't start in the garden. It goes out of Eden to water the garden, and then from there it splits and becomes 4 separate river systems. So already Genesis is hinting at 2 different scales at once. On the one hand you have this irrigated, very domestic space. A garden in Hebrew, the word is gan, which can mean an enclosed, cultivated plot. Think irrigation channels, controlled growth, fruit trees you can actually reach without climbing a cliff. It's intimate, walkable space. You can stroll through it in the cool of the day. On the other hand, that same garden sits downstream of what sounds like a cosmic plumbing hub, a single source that branches out and feeds entire regions. 4 rivers with names that reach far beyond any local orchard. Pishon associated with gold and aromatic resins. Gihon tied to the land of Cush. Then Tigris and Euphrates, which anyone in the ancient Near East would have recognized as the major arteries of Mesopotamia. So Genesis is holding attention right from the start. Eden as spot, this enclosed walkable garden where humans tend and keep. And Eden as source, a place where the world's water systems are somehow connected and launched. If you're used to thinking in terms of modern geography, this feels like a problem. Where on earth could a single river plausibly feed all 4 of those systems? But in an ancient cosmology, this isn't a bug. It's a feature. The point is less, could we GPS this? And more, this is the place where abundance starts. Now, fast forward a few centuries of storytelling, exile and temple destruction, and listen to what happens when the prophet Ezekiel talks about Eden. In Ezekiel 28 and 31, Eden is no longer just a lush riverside grove. Suddenly, we're on a mountain. We hear phrases like the Garden of God, the holy mountain of God and stones of fire. The imagery pulls Eden upward, wraps it in sanctuary language, and drops it into a cosmic temple setting. In Ezekiel 28, the prophet speaks against the ruler of Tyre using Eden language. But the description goes way beyond a human king. You get this being placed on the holy mountain of God, moving in the midst of the stones of fire, covered in precious stones that sound suspiciously like the priestly breastpiece from Exodus. It's Eden, but it's also priesthood, and it's also a mountain sanctuary. In Ezekiel 31, Assyria is compared to a colossal cedar in the Garden of God, towering over all the other trees, watered by deep springs. Again, you have Eden as an archetype, but the scale has shifted. This is imperial, cosmic, royal language. Trees are kings, garden is God's domain, water is power. Then in Ezekiel 40:48, the prophet has this massive vision of a restored temple. And tucked near the end, in chapter 47, there's a detail that should make Genesis 2 light up in your brain. In this vision, a trickle of water starts under the threshold of the temple, flows out, and becomes a river. As it goes, it deepens, it brings life, it heals even the salt sea. Trees grow along its banks, whose leaves offer healing, and whose fruit never fails. Temple at the top, water emerging from it, river flowing out, making dead places live, feeding the world. Does that sound familiar? In a way, Ezekiel is taking the Genesis pattern and rotating it 90 degrees. Instead of a river going out of Eden to water the garden, you get a river going out of a sanctuary complex, a temple, to renew the land. Instead of a flat, enclosed orchard, you get a vertical cosmic structure, mountain, temple, spring, river, world. And that's not random. In the broader ancient Near Eastern world, garden isn't just a backyard with tomatoes. Royal gardens are symbols of kingship, power, and godlike control over chaos. The Assyrian kings carved reliefs of themselves hunting in lush, irrigated parks, stocked with exotic animals. Babylonian and Persian kings built palace gardens fed by engineered water systems that shouted, "Look at the human who can make the desert bloom." Temple complexes also borrowed this imagery. You get sacred groves, palm trees carved on walls, floral and fruit motifs on pillars, water basins called seas. To walk into a major sanctuary was, in a sense, to walk into a controlled piece of cosmic garden, a little patch of ordered creation pressed up against the divine presence. So when Hebrew texts call Eden the Garden of God, that phrase is doing double duty. Yes, it evokes a lush space with trees and rivers. But it also carries royal and temple overtones. This is the divine king's private park, the primal sanctuary where heaven and earth overlap, the prototypical palace-temple installation. Genesis gives you the ground-level version, humans placed in a cultivated, irrigated zone, working and guarding it, language that later gets used for priests serving in the temple. Ezekiel zooms out and tilts the camera upward. Eden as holy mountain, Eden as sanctum, Eden as architectural blueprint for the kind of place where God's presence dwells. Now we can start to see why Second Temple writers, those people behind the Dead Sea Scrolls and their cousins, had no problem reading Eden as more than a little orchard east of nowhere. By their time, Eden language had already been stretched vertically. Mountain of God, sanctuary of God, river from the temple, garden as royal precinct. Put that together, and Eden becomes an elevated sacred zone, a high place where divine presence sits, from which life-giving waters flow downward to the rest of creation. Not a flat patch of farmland you could fence off and sell in real estate parcels, but a cosmic source region, the top of a spiritual hydrological system. That's the key tension we need to keep on the table. Genesis's intimate irrigated spot where humans dig, prune and name versus Ezekiel's vast, elevated, temple mountain from which rivers of life proceed. Same vocabulary, same root story, but two very different scale models of reality. And once Eden can function as both a garden and a mountain sanctuary, both a specific plot and a cosmic source, Second Temple authors suddenly have a lot of room to play. They can locate Eden in height instead of on a flat map. Up becomes just as important as east, springs and headwaters become theological clues, not just background scenery. Which means that when a Qumran text hints at paradise, or talks about a restored temple, or describes a river flowing from the presence of God, we're not just hearing echoes of Genesis 2. We're hearing the whole biblical evolution of Eden imagery, from enclosed garden to cosmic mountain temple. And that evolution is exactly what's going to make the four rivers problem in Genesis, and the geography clues in the scrolls a lot stranger and a lot more interesting than they first appear. So let's zoom back in on that one verse we rushed past. The river that goes out of Eden and splits into four. Genesis actually names them, and it doesn't just give you rivers, it gives you little mini atlases attached to each one. The name of the first is Pishon. It winds through the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold. The gold of that land is good, aromatic resin and onyx stone are there. The name of the second river is Gihon. It winds through the whole land of Cush. The name of the third river is the Tigris. It runs along the east of Ashur. And the fourth river is the Euphrates. If you were an ancient listener, some of those would land with a thud of recognition, and some would feel hazier. The Tigris and Euphrates are the easy ones. Those are the backbone of Mesopotamia, the great twin rivers of empire. Babylon, Assyria, later Persia, these are the places where world history, as far as an ancient Israelite was concerned, actually happens. Those rivers are political geography as much as physical geography. But Pishon, Gihon, Havilah, Cush, those names live in a fuzzier space. They show up in different lists and stories. Havilah can be around Arabia in some texts, but in other traditions it drifts. Cush is usually associated with regions south of Egypt, Nubia, Sudan, that kind of direction, but later Jewish and Christian writers start floating other possibilities. Pishon and Gihon themselves don't match any river you can just go stand next to and say, there it is. So you're immediately dealing with asymmetry. Two rivers everyone knows, two rivers nobody can confidently put on a modern map. Two lands you can vaguely triangulate. Two that feel like they're being stretched to fit. And then there's the structural problem. Genesis doesn't say a river goes out of Eden and later, after a lot of meandering and tributaries, eventually you can get to these four famous rivers if you keep portaging. It says the river goes out of Eden, waters the garden, and from there it splits and becomes four heads or headwaters. In hydrology, rivers don't do that. Headwaters converge. They don't diverge. Small streams join to make a big river. Big rivers don't typically split into four major world-spanning systems right at their source. And if we try to take the text literally as a single physical spot, we hit a wall even faster. Tigris and Euphrates share a general region. Fine. But then we're told about a river encircling all the land of Havilah with gold and aromatic resins, a description that fits better with Arabia or areas along the eastern desert margins, and another river that encircles all the land of Cush, which almost everyone in antiquity associated with the far south. On one map, you're somewhere in Mesopotamia. On another, you're leaning hard into Arabia. On a third, you're down toward Nubia. All of them are supposed to be downstream of the same source, branching off just outside the Gate of Eden. You can see why generations of readers, including very smart, very devout ones, have tried to solve this. Maybe the Pishon was the now dry Wadi Batin in Arabia. Maybe Gihon is the Nile or one of its branches. Maybe Cush is actually a region of Mesopotamia that happened to share the same name. Maybe some massive geological change happened after the flood. But when you zoom out and look at how the names work together, another possibility comes into focus. Genesis 2 looks less like a precise satellite photo and more like a composite map. Imagine somebody taking the most important edges of the known world, the great river systems, the gold lands, the exotic south, and projecting them backward into a single origin story. Not because they were naive about geography, but because they were arranging the world theologically. Scholars have floated a few overlapping ways this could have happened. One option: you're hearing the echo of multiple regional memories. Different communities that revered different rivers as lifelines converge into a single narrative. A tradition that loved the Nile's power gets folded into a tradition that centered the Tigris and Euphrates, which then gets blended with memories of Arabian trade routes and their gold lands. By the time Genesis is written in something like its final form, the storyteller isn't choosing between them. Eden is above all of them. Its river feeds them all. Another option: editorial stitching. Earlier stories about a sacred source and two rivers, or about a gold-rich region with a holy spring, get joined together. Instead of throwing any of it away, an editor keeps the pieces and solves the tension by pushing Eden further upstream than any one locale. The more rivers it produces, the more obviously cosmic it becomes. And then there's the symbolic cartography angle. In a world without Google Earth, major rivers aren't just water. They're axes, borders, the lines along which kingdoms rise, armies march, and trade moves. Naming 4 rivers that radiate into 4 different directions can feel less like a hiking guide and more like a way of saying, from this place, all the ordered world flows. Ancient audiences were perfectly capable of hearing geography that way. Rivers mark the edges of empires. From the river of Egypt to the Great River, the Euphrates becomes shorthand for the full range of promised territory. The Nile or the Euphrates could stand in for entire civilizations. Saying a river encircles a land is more about symbolic embrace than literal hydrological behavior. So the 4 rivers in Genesis can operate on that symbolic level. They frame the world north and east with Tigris and Euphrates, south with Cush, possibly west or southeast with Havilah and its gold. Eden isn't on one of those rivers. It's conceptually upstream of all of them. It sits at the notional centre where abundance, wealth, and imperial power ultimately derive. Once you see the text playing this game, the problem of not being able to find Eden on a modern map starts to look a lot less like a mistake and more like the point. The geography is intentionally overstretched. The story wants Eden to be the fountainhead behind every important river system anyone had heard of. And that is exactly the kind of flexible, layered geography the Dead Sea Scrolls inherit. By the Second Temple period, Israel's writers are already used to thinking with maps that double as theologies. Eden can be north, south, and up all at once. Rivers can signal cosmic order, covenant borders, or future restoration, depending on how you read them. The scrolls don't resolve that ambiguity. In many cases, they turn the volume up, combining biblical rivers, prophetic visions, and new symbolic landscapes into even more composite maps. Before we watch them do that, though, we need one more piece in place. What it means to call Eden not just a garden in a region, but the fountainhead of the world's waters. That's where the language of source, springs, and headwaters becomes crucial. So let's grab that last phrase Genesis uses and put it under a microscope. The river became 4 heads. That word head is doing a lot of work. In Hebrew and in a lot of ancient languages, head language spills out into everything. A head of a person, a head of a family, a head of a year, a head of a river. It's not just a body part. It's the starting point, the chief, the thing that stands at the front of everything else. So when Genesis says the one river out of Eden became 4 heads, you're already in conceptual territory more than topographical. You're not staring at a fork in a creek. You're being told that Eden's water is the head behind other heads. The world's big rivers, the world's boundary markers and lifelines, are being treated as downstream expressions of something higher, older, more primary. Ancient listeners were comfortable with that kind of stacked metaphor. Head of the month doesn't mean there's a literal skull on the calendar. Head of the clan doesn't mean somebody's severed cranium is in charge. Headwaters could be treated the same way. You can think hydrologically where the river physically starts, but also hierarchically what stands over or behind it as its ultimate source. Once you let that sink in, the whole scene shifts. Instead of hunting for a place where 4 literal channels split off, you start asking what sort of reality could be imagined as upstream of all the world's river heads at once. And that is where sacred hydrology comes in. In the ancient Near East, holy places and holy water go together constantly. Temples are built over springs. Shrines sit near rivers or wells. Gods are linked to particular sources. A spring is never just a convenient faucet. It's a portal. Life comes out of it. The underworld leaks through it. The god's favour is literally bubbling up from the ground. Biblical writers know this world. They stand in it and argue with it. Jerusalem in particular is wrapped around a spring with a very loaded name, Gihon. Same name as one of Eden's rivers. The city's survival depends on it. Kings are anointed by it. Hezekiah digs a tunnel to secure it. Later interpreters notice that resonance between a city spring and a primeval river, and do not think it's an accident. And then look at how prophetic texts talk about future restoration. Over and over, you get this image, water flowing out from the temple or the presence of God, heading downhill to heal everything it touches. Ezekiel has the famous vision of a trickle coming out from the temple threshold, growing into a river that runs east, down into the Arabah, down toward the salty waters. As it flows, it makes bitter water fresh. Trees grow on its banks with leaves for healing. That is Eden logic being replayed. A sacred centre with a river coming out, turning dead zones into orchards. Joel does something similar. A fountain will come forth from the house of the Lord and water the valley of Shittim. Zechariah imagines living waters flowing out from Jerusalem in 2 directions, summer and winter. The direction and geography are elastic, but the core is the same. The holy place is framed as a hydrological source. Life and order literally run downhill from the presence of God. You can probably already see how that plugs back into Genesis. Eden is not just a nice park. It is the primordial temple mountain, the place where God walks, from which waters go out to organize the chaos around it. The garden is a localized space, but Eden itself is an upstream reality. The rivers are ways of saying, from here, divine life radiates into the world's systems. Now drop that idea into the landscape of Qumran and the Dead Sea. This is one of the most hydrologically dramatic regions you can stand in. On the surface it's stark, blistering heat, salt flats, a lake so dense nothing lives in it. But if you know where to look, water is everywhere in extreme, unstable forms. You have perennial springs like En-Gedi and En-Feshka bursting out of the cliffs, little explosions of Edenic green, right on the edge of the saltiest water body on earth. You have wadis that look dry and harmless most of the year, then turn into lethal flash floods when rare storms dump rain in the Judean hills. You have an inland basin where every drop that flows in has nowhere to go. No outlet to the sea, just evaporation and salt. For people living there, water is never just background. It's fate. A spring can mean life for a settlement, a flock, a sect. A sudden flood can wipe out crops, camps, even scroll libraries if you pick the wrong cave. Every cup of clean water requires effort, storage, management. You feel in your bones that you are perched between blessing and curse every single day. That tension between life-giving springs and death-laden salt supercharges symbolic readings. Biblical texts already tie rain and rivers to covenant obedience. If you walk in my statutes, I will give you rain in its season. Withholding rain is judgment. Opening springs is mercy. Living in a place where one hillside is desert and the next ravine hides a waterfall makes that theology tangible. You don't have to imagine blessing like rain. You watch it carve channels in front of you. So when a community like the one at Qumran reads Genesis and the prophets, they aren't neutrally mapping geography. They're hearing their own world vibrate. A single river going out from a holy centre and dividing into world-shaping waterways. That's not a puzzle to solve with coordinates. It's a pattern. Source above, branching below. Pure origin feeding mixed, contested territories. Springs in the heights sending water down into deadly basins that may or may not be healed. In that frame, Eden becomes less a pin on a map and more an upstream condition. Think of it as the ideal state from which all real rivers, all real lands, derive whatever life they have. You never have to stand at the spring of Eden to participate in it. Every time water flows where it shouldn't, an oasis in desert, a fresh spring by a salt sea, that's a local echo of the primordial source, a fragment of Eden's river peeking through, and that upstream-downstream logic is exactly the move the Dead Sea Scrolls will lean into. They can talk about Eden as a past place and as a future reality. They can link temple, community, and spring in ways that treat them all as channels of the same hidden source. They can stand beside an actual spring above the Dead Sea, a tiny miracle of fresh water overlooking a lifeless basin, and see in it a live-action parable of their entire theology, a pure headwater feeding a broken world. Before we read their texts that way, we need to watch how they map that tension onto their own landscape of borders, wilderness, and contested ground. That's where Qumran's geography starts to matter. So imagine you're part of this sect, and you walk out your front door at Qumran. You're not stepping into a cosy village with vineyards and olive groves. You're stepping onto the lip of a cliff that drops into a moonscape. To your east is the Dead Sea, a flat, glittering sheet of death water. To your west, the Judean Highlands, bare slopes that bake all day and bleed sudden floods when the clouds finally crack. It's harsh, but it's not random. Groups like the one behind the Dead Sea Scrolls don't seem to have ended up here by accident. The Judean desert is an ideological choice. It's a place you pick when you want to separate, to be tested, to strip life down to its covenant essentials. Biblically, desert or wilderness isn't just a spot with low rainfall. It's contested space on the edge of order. Israel comes into being there. The Torah is given there. The people are tested there, to see what's really in their hearts. Prophets retreat there. John the Baptist shows up there. Later Christian monks head there. It's like the default setting for back to basics with God. So when a Second Temple community says, in effect, we are the true covenant keepers, the rest of Israel is compromised, where do you go to live out that claim? Not the crowded, polluted city. You go back to the place of beginnings. You go into the wilderness. In Jewish tradition, that desert setting does something symbolic. It rewinds the story. Before Israel has a king, before it settles land and draws borders and builds a temple, it is a camp in a wasteland, fed by miraculous water and food, guided by a moving cloud of glory, kept alive by obedience and mercy. The wilderness is where the people are raw, dependent, unbuffered. It's like a national Eden reset. No cities, no idols, just God, people, and whatever the desert will or won't give. That return to beginnings motif gets picked up all over later literature. Hosea imagines God alluring unfaithful Israel into the wilderness, to speak kindly, almost like redoing the honeymoon phase. Isaiah pictures a highway through the desert for the restored exiles. The desert isn't only punishment, it's also the place where a new start can happen. Now put the Qumran group in that stream of thought. They see their present Jerusalem as defiled. The temple system is corrupt. The priesthood is wrong. The calendar is off. You can't fix that by staying in the middle of it. So you reenact the Exodus in miniature. You leave the settled land. You plant your community in the wild edge zone overlooking a cursed sea and say, we're the ones reliving the real story. But here's where geography turns into something even more interesting: boundary keeping. If you read the sectarian scrolls, you start running into a lot of spatial language. Camps, gates, zones, who can eat where, who can stand where, who can come within how many cubits of a holy object or a sacred meal. This is desert logic carried to an extreme. Think about the wilderness camp in Numbers. Tribes arranged in specific positions around the tabernacle, Levites in one ring, the sanctuary in the centre, impurity pushed outside the camp. Certain diseases, certain bodily states, certain behaviours get you expelled to the perimeter until you're clean again. The camp isn't just people, it's a moving sacred map. The Qumran community seems to take that basic model and scale it into an entire worldview. You get rules about a council of purity, about how far the sons of light can mix with outsiders, about who can join the covenant and under what conditions. You find texts describing a future ideal camp, a future ideal temple city laid out in measured squares. You can feel them thinking in circles and lines, inside and outside, near and far. The desert is the perfect testing ground for that mentality, because out there, boundaries are survival. You need to know where your camp ends and the dangerous wadi begins, where your cistern water is kept pure and where animals drink, where night watch begins, where Sabbath boundaries are. Space is never neutral, it's moral, and that constant practice of drawing lines in the sand, literally, starts to bleed into how you see the whole world. In their writings you get a cosmic version of the camp, the lot of light and the lot of darkness. Angels over one realm, demonic forces over the other. Humanity sorted into those who stand in the covenant and those who don't. The geography of the desert becomes a metaphor for the geography of existence. There is a centre where God's order holds, and a surrounding wasteland where chaos and impurity lurk. That's why inside and outside language is so charged in these texts. Inside means more than physically present in the settlement. It means ritually pure, doctrinally aligned, submissive to the group's interpretation of Torah. Outside isn't just other nations. It's also your fellow Jews who, in their view, have joined the wrong calendar, the wrong priesthood, the wrong politics. Geography and identity collapse into each other. Where you stand on the map mirrors where you stand in the covenant. Now bring Eden back into the picture. If you live by this inside-outside desert logic, Eden is not just a pretty origin myth. It becomes the archetypal inside space, a walled garden, a well-watered high place, a zone of direct presence where God walks and humans serve. Outside, it is the wild, the thorns, the wandering. You can see how easily that turns into a coded map. For a group obsessed with purity perimeters, Eden imagery becomes shorthand for their own community ideals and their temple theology. The true Eden is wherever God's order holds, wherever the right priesthood and the right calendar and the right sacrifices are maintained. The garden is the covenant camp, the rest is exile. And because they're sitting on the edge of the Dead Sea, staring every day at a landscape that already looks like a judgment scene, that contrast gets supercharged. Fresh springs versus salty basin, camp versus wilderness, Eden-like order versus chaotic outside. So when they talk about Eden, rivers and a guarded garden, they may also be talking about something very close to home, how to organize space, draw borders, and imagine their cracked little desert community as a preview of the restored temple world they believe is coming. To see how far they push that, we have to look at how they read one of Isaiah's strangest images, a highway through the wilderness that somehow reorganizes the whole map. Once you start thinking of Eden as the ultimate inside zone, it runs straight into another ancient obsession, temples. Across the ancient Near East, you get this recurring idea that a temple is not just a fancy religious building. It's a scale model of the universe, a microcosmos, the place where heaven and earth are stitched together, and the way things are supposed to be is acted out in stone, metal, water, and blood. Babylon has its ziggurats, stepped mountains, linking earth to the divine realm. Egypt has temple complexes that double as cosmic diagrams, sacred lakes for the primeval waters, columns carved like papyrus stalks from the first marsh. Israel's neighbours are doing similar things. In that world, architecture is cosmology in 3 dimensions. Israel's sanctuary fits right into that pattern, but with its own twist. If you strip the tabernacle and later the Jerusalem temple down to their symbolic bones, they echo the creation story. You have an outer court, like the wider earth, an inner holy place, more ordered, decorated, lit. Then the Holy of Holies, the unreachable centre where God's presence dwells above the ark, between the cherubim. It's like concentric rings of increasing Edenness, from ordinary space toward a guarded, lush, fully ordered centre. The biblical descriptions lean into that. In Exodus, when God gives Moses the tabernacle pattern, you get lampstands shaped like almond trees with blossoms and cups. You get woven cherubim, guardians of the inner space. In Solomon's temple, the walls are carved with palm trees, flowers and gourds. 2 immense cherubim overshadow the ark. There's a great basin called the Sea, sitting on 12 oxen, that likely echoes both the primeval waters and the ordered seas of creation. The Temple Mount itself becomes a kind of artificial mountain. Then you hit Ezekiel 28 and 47, and the lines tighten even more. Eden is on the holy mountain of God. A river flows out from under the temple threshold, turning salty dead water into fresh, making trees grow whose fruit never fails. Creation, Eden, mountain, temple, water, trees. They start to stack on top of each other until it's hard to tell if you're reading about a garden, a sanctuary, or a cosmic blueprint. So, when a Second Temple Jew thinks Eden, it's not just some lush park somewhere east. It sounds a lot like the inner logic of a temple done right. And that's exactly the sore point in this period, is the temple actually done right? By the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Jerusalem temple is physically standing, smoking with sacrifices, filled with singing priests. But it's also the centre of bitter argument. Different groups are fighting over who has the correct priestly line, the correct sacrificial calendar, the correct way to handle purity. You get Pharisees, Sadducees, later the early Jesus movement, all defining themselves in part by what they think of that building on Mount Zion. The Qumran sect takes one of the most radical stances. The temple is there, but God is not truly with it. The calendar is wrong. The priests are illegitimate. The sacrifices are polluted. As long as that's the case, you can't just walk up to the temple and expect to find Eden at the centre. So what do you do when you believe the only true cosmic centre on Earth has been hijacked? One solution is, you leave and you build a portable version. You can see that move happening in the scrolls. On the surface, a lot of it looks like obsessive religious micromanagement, endless rules about washing, who can eat what when, who can sit where in the assembly, how to admit new members after years of testing. But under that is a clear idea. If Eden Temple is about ordered holiness radiating out from a pure centre, then you can approximate it through ritual and layout, wherever you are. You don't need to physically relocate to the garden. You reproduce its conditions. That's why their purity regulations are not just about personal morality. They're spatial engineering. Impurity is pushed outward. The pure core is guarded. Access is graded. The camp reads like a mobile sanctuary, a centre of teaching and prayer functioning almost like a holy place, layers of membership tiers around it, and then the wider world on the outside, coded as chaotic and unclean, and the liturgy in the scrolls ramps this up even more. You find songs that put the community praying in sync with angelic worship in heaven. You get texts where they see themselves standing alongside the holy ones offering praise in what sounds like a liturgical temple above. The physical temple in Jerusalem may be compromised, but in their daily and festival prayers they're stepping, by imagination and ritual, into an invisible sanctuary that is perfectly ordered. In that imagined space, Eden motifs quietly return. Heavenly temples have radiant stones, shining metal, ordered ranks like trees planted in rows. The blessings they pronounce talk about abundance, water, healing, fruitfulness, light instead of darkness. When they picture the future ideal temple city in other texts, it's filled with rivers, perfectly measured gates, and, again, decorated with precious metals and stones. It's Ezekiel's river vision and Genesis's gemstone list all over again, but now projected onto an idealized sacred architecture. So instead of shipping you off to some hidden garden on an ancient map, the scroll's world pushes you toward a different kind of location logic. Eden is wherever God's rule is enacted so thoroughly that creation itself snaps back into harmony. A right temple, with right priests, right calendar, right boundary rules, becomes a miniature Eden in the middle of a hostile landscape, even if that landscape is a rocky spur over a hypersaline lake. That's the pivot that makes their geography so slippery and so interesting. They absolutely care about physical sites, Zion, the desert, the Dead Sea, the nations. But they're also treating place as something you can upgrade through correct ordering. A corrupted Temple Mount can functionally become Exile. A faithful wilderness camp can functionally become holy ground. Which leaves us with a sharp question that hangs over the rest of the discussion. When Genesis points you toward Eden with rivers, stones, and a guarded centre, is it mostly handing you coordinates on the globe, or a template for how sacred space is supposed to work? If Eden is a temple-ordered world in miniature, then any project to restore Eden is less about finding the old garden, and more about redrawing the map with a new centre. And that's exactly the move the scrolls make next. When Isaiah's highway in the wilderness stops being just poetry and starts to look like a plan for how God will literally reorganize the earth. Once you've turned your camp into a kind of mobile Eden temple, one big question immediately pops up. How does this little pocket of order ever reconnect with the real centre of the world? For the Qumran writers, that's where another biblical image becomes absolutely central. The way in the wilderness. You hear it in Isaiah 40, the famous line. A voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God." To most modern readers that sounds like metaphor. Comforting religious poetry, maybe an image for spiritual renewal. To a community actually living out in the desert, on the edge of the Dead Sea, that line stops being just a metaphor and starts looking suspiciously like a travel plan. Because in the scrolls, the way is not just a moral lifestyle, it's a route. And they treat routes as theology. In the rule of the community, they describe their entire life together as walking on the way in the wilderness. In the Damascus document, they say, God led them into the desert to prepare there the way, just like it was written by the prophet Isaiah. When they call themselves the way, they're not just saying, we have good ethics. They're saying we are literally the advance team laying out God's road back into the land. And in the ancient Near East, roads like that carry a lot of political weight. Think about how imperial highways function. When an empire cuts a straight engineered road across difficult terrain, it's not just for convenience. It's a claim. This space is under our control. We can move troops, taxes, and messages through here whenever we want. The landscape is being disciplined into submission. Biblical texts know this. When kings come with chariots and horses on established roads, they're moving along these veins of imperial power. When a prophet imagines a highway that God himself will walk on, levelling hills and filling valleys, that's not just scenic language. It's a quiet way of saying, the map is going to be redrawn. The one who really owns this land is about to mark it with his own infrastructure. The Qumran writers plug themselves right into that idea. They read Isaiah and similar passages as blueprints. There will be a day when God appears in glory and marches back into Zion through the wilderness. Ahead of that, there must be a purified people out there, aligned, rehearsed, organised, literally standing in formation along the route. Some of the war scrolls even imagine troops arranged by tribes, banners and ranks, like a living road straight through the chaos. In that sense, their desert life is an Exodus reenactment with the volume turned up. The first Exodus was a movement out of Egypt, through wilderness, to a promised land and a sanctuary. God led the way in a pillar of cloud and fire, and Israel camped in ordered formation around the tabernacle. The path itself was a story, from slavery to service, from chaos to ordered worship. The Scrolls community sees themselves as doing that again, but this time with the temple in Jerusalem coded as a kind of Egypt. Corrupted authority, false priests, wrong calendar. So they go out again into the wilderness to wait for the real move of God. Their rules, their camp layout, their calendar, their purity practices, all of it is them lining up on that future highway, ready to move when the pillar appears again. This is where the geography gets weirdly literal and symbolic at the same time. On one level, they're just a small group of people in caves and camps near the Dead Sea. On another level, they're convinced that the very terrain around them, the desert slopes, the wadis, the open spaces, are the stage for the final act of history. When they read, "Make straight in the desert a highway for our God," they hear, "Clear a path through compromised institutions, through polluted territory, through the crooked politics of Judea." When they read of a way of holiness where the unclean cannot pass, they hear, "Our own regulations about who can be admitted, who can march, who can eat at the communal meal." It's all one big choreography of movement from outside to inside, from wilderness to restored centre. And here's the twist for Eden. Up to now, Eden has mostly sounded like an origin point, a garden in the east that humanity once lived in and got expelled from. A tragic backstory. But if your whole spiritual life is organised around the way in the wilderness, the logic flips. Eden becomes less the lost starting place and more the destination at the end of the road. The highway doesn't take you back in time, it takes you forward into a renewed version of what Eden represented. Isaiah already pushes that direction. His visions of the transformed land, desert blooming, waters breaking out in the wilderness, predators no longer dangerous, sound suspiciously Eden-like. Add in the temple river imagery from Ezekiel, and the destination at the far end of the wilderness highway starts to look like a new garden temple on a holy mountain, irrigating everything around it. The Qumran community slots themselves in as the people between those two poles, the broken present and the restored centre. They don't only care where Eden once was, they care where Eden conditions will reappear. The route God takes to get there, through which regions, with which people, under which priesthood, on which calendar is the whole ballgame. Arguing over roads is arguing over legitimacy. So when they talk about the way, they're making a claim. We, not the Jerusalem establishment, are aligned with the true axis of history. Our camp sits along the line that runs between God's current hiddenness and God's future visible reign. Our desert is not a random nowhere. It's the corridor along which God will rebuild the world. That's the interpretive payoff of paying attention to this wilderness way motif. It shows you how, for them, land is not a backdrop. It's a script. Desert and city, mountain and valley, road and river. Each feature is a line of stage direction in the drama of creation, exile and restoration. Genesis gave an origin scene in a well-watered place, guarded by cherubim. Isaiah and Ezekiel sketch a future scene in a healed land, radiating out from a temple mount, with highways leading in and rivers flowing out. The Dead Sea Scrolls are written by people who read those scenes together and say, we are living in the transition shot between them. And once you see that, a lot of Eden language stops being about pinning down a garden on an ancient map and starts being about tracing the path between a broken world and a healed one. The clincher is that, in their imagination, even directions east, west, up, down start carrying this same freight. Not just coordinates, but verdicts about where you are in the story. And that's where we go next, when East of Eden stops being a vague somewhere and turns into a whole exile logic written into the landscape. East of Eden sounds like a poetic way of saying far from home. But in the Bible's geography, east isn't just somewhere over there, it's a direction with a verdict attached. Watch how early this starts, in Genesis. Humans are placed in a garden that's said to be in Eden, in the east. But when they're expelled, they don't just get kicked out. They're driven east of Eden, and the cherubim are stationed at the east of the garden to block re-entry. Cain kills Abel, and what happens? He goes out from the presence of the Lord and settles in the land of Nod again, east of Eden. So the very first time the biblical story talks about humans moving through the landscape, the motion isn't neutral. It's a one-way slide, out from God's presence toward the east. You start to see a pattern. Lot lifts up his eyes, sees the fertile Jordan plain like the garden of the Lord, and moves east. It looks Eden-like, but the story treats his eastward move as a kind of spiritual misstep, a drift towards Sodom. When the tower builders gather in Shinar, they've come from the east. When Israel is exiled to Babylon, they're taken to the east. At every level from primeval stories to imperial history, eastward movement keeps showing up as movement away. Away from the sanctuary, away from the land, away from the centre. And then the return stories invert it. The exiles in Babylon don't come back to Jerusalem from the west. They stream back from the east, moving westward toward the land and up toward the temple. Pilgrims ascend from the east side of the Mount of Olives to enter Jerusalem. Ezekiel's visionary temple faces east, and the glory of God departs toward the east, then returns again from the east, re-entering the house. The same physical direction east is bouncing back and forth. Going east is exile. Coming from the east toward Zion is restoration. The disciples stand on the Mount of Olives looking east across the Jordan Valley, knowing that's where exiles went and where the Lord's return is expected to appear. So this isn't a GPS system, it's a moral compass drawn onto a real map. You can see how this works as a kind of code. Instead of saying far from God or outside the covenant, the text shows you someone going east. Instead of saying God is approaching the sanctuary, it shows you glory moving from the east to the temple, or pilgrims coming up from the surrounding lands. Directional language becomes theology in shorthand. That's important, because Second Temple texts, both biblical and extra-biblical, are obsessed with exile. Not just the one to Babylon, but the whole human condition as exile, out from the land, out from Eden, out from the full presence of God. So when you read later writings, including those at Qumran, you don't just watch for Babylon or Assyria, you pay attention to which way people are pointed. The scrolls are full of this kind of directional thinking. They accuse the Jerusalem priesthood of having turned aside from the right path. They describe wicked rulers as walking in the ways of darkness. The community itself is said to be in the wilderness, which, in their imagination, is eastward, beyond the cultivated land and its compromised centre. They're replaying Israel's story, pushed out, waiting for return. And Eden's east gate is the first template for that. Notice something else. In biblical narratives, westward isn't as loud a category word, but toward the Lord, toward Zion, toward the sanctuary, often line up with a west and up orientation if you're coming from the great eastern exile zones, Mesopotamia, Transjordan, the desert. In other words, you don't have to say west. You say to the house of the Lord, and everyone around Judea knows the topography. Up to the hills of Judah, up to Jerusalem, up to the temple that sits on a ridgeline, facing the desert. That's how direction can encode theology without ever giving you a coordinate. Now drop yourself back at Qumran, stand on that shoreline. Look across the Dead Sea. What's on the other side? Moab and Ammon, regions the Bible loves to associate with complicated, often hostile neighbours. The route into exile across the Jordan and beyond. The world of foreign kings and strange cults. In some stories, the staging ground from which trouble comes toward Israel. For a community on the Dead Sea's western edge, that eastern horizon is not neutral either. Every sunrise for them is the sun coming up over the territories that, in Jewish memory, were somewhere between suspect and outright dangerous. It's where some conquering armies come from. It's where Israel faltered with Baal worship. It's also, crucially, where a lot of Judeans fled during various crises, seeking refuge, but also, in some sense, leaving the covenant centre behind. So their physical east, the other side of the water, is a layered symbol, exile lands, foreign rule, compromised worship, escape routes. If Eden is coded as the original sanctuary, and if expulsion from Eden is coded as east, then the Dead Sea Basin is a kind of lived-in metaphor. They're camped near the lowest place on earth, staring across the water toward the old exile spaces, reading their Bibles about humans driven east of Eden and nations dragged east to Babylon. They can feel bodily what it means to be outside and to long for a move back toward the centre. This is where a lot of modern readers miss the subtlety. When we ask, where was Eden? We want a pin on a satellite map. Maybe southern Iraq, maybe eastern Turkey, maybe somewhere under the Persian Gulf. But the texts often behave as if Eden is less a dot and more an orientation system. You're either moving Edenward or Eden away. For Second Temple Jews, especially a sect that thinks of itself as a righteous remnant, that orientation lines up neatly with purity. Toward holiness is, in effect, back toward Eden. Away from holiness, toward idolatry, moral chaos or ritual pollution, is farther east even if you're physically walking north or south. So Eden becomes not only an origin story but a compass rose. North, south, east and west don't disappear. They just get moral shading. East is associated with expulsion and foreign power. Westward and templeward up to Zion are associated with return, restoration, and re-entry into sacred space. The desert can be both exile and preparation zone, depending on whether you're just out there or out there on the way back. The Qumran community leans hard into this logic by situating themselves in the wilderness but facing, liturgically and imaginatively, toward a purified temple. They're saying, we know which way Eden is. Not in the sense of, it's 60 miles that way, but in the sense of we know which direction history must move for creation to be healed. Their camp becomes like an arrow drawn on the land, pointing from the chaos at the margins toward the promised centre. They're not alone in this. Other Second Temple texts, Jubilees, 1 Enoch, later Apocalypses, play with world maps, dividing the earth into righteous and unrighteous zones, describing the Holy Land as the navel or centre, and drawing Eden somewhere on that sacred axis. Often the exact spot is blurry, but the orientation is not. Holiness runs along a line that connects heaven, Eden, Zion, and future paradise. Once you see that, East of Eden stops being just a literary flourish. It's the first entry in a directional grammar that will keep getting reused. Garden to exile, land to Babylon, temple to wilderness, earth to heaven and back. Each move is drawn on a real landscape, but each direction is quietly telling you where you stand in the story of separation and return. And that's why the next big clue, mountains and upward language, matters so much. If east signals distance from God, up will start to signal nearness. Eden turns vertical as well as horizontal, and the search for its location climbs with it. If east and west are about distance, up and down are about altitude of relationship. Ancient people didn't need climate data or satellite imagery to notice one basic fact. The higher you go, the thinner the human crowd, the bigger the sky, the more exposed you feel to whatever is above. Storms roll in over peaks. Snow sits on mountaintops long after the valleys have turned green. From the lowlands you look up and see clouds snagged on ridges like the hem of heaven touching earth. So, across the ancient Near East, mountains become the natural meeting points of worlds. You see this everywhere. In Mesopotamia, they literally build artificial mountains, ziggurats, as stairways for the gods. In Canaanite religion, Baal rules from a mountain. In Ugaritic texts, Mount Zaphon is the divine headquarters. In Greek tradition, it's Olympus. In the wider Levant, high places, Barmot, dot the ridgelines as cult sites. Israel's scriptures don't reject that impulse so much as re-aim it. Sinai is the obvious one. The mountain is wrapped in cloud, thunder and fire. God comes down on the top. Moses goes up to meet him. The people stay below at a safe distance because the mountain has become a live wire between realms. You don't wander onto that kind of ground uninvited. Zion is the other pole. Jerusalem is not actually the tallest peak around, but in the Bible's imagination it becomes the mountain of the Lord lifted above the hills, the place from which instruction and blessing flow. And here's where Eden quietly joins the mountain club. In Genesis, Eden is described flatly as a garden with a river that splits into four. But by the time you get to Ezekiel, Eden has begun to climb. The prophet speaks of the garden of God and of a holy mountain of God, and sometimes those phrases blur into each other. In Ezekiel 28, the Prince of Tyre is pictured as a kind of primordial figure in Eden, the garden of God, and also on the holy mountain of God, walking among flaming stones. Garden, mountain, same scene. Later Jewish traditions pick up that merge. Second Temple texts and rabbinic writings start speaking of Eden as elevated, sometimes as the highest point on a cosmic axis that runs from the depths below, through the land of Israel, up to the heavens. Why? Because elevation solves a problem in the Genesis description that has bugged geographers for a long time. Think through the water system. A single river goes out of Eden and from there divides into four headwaters that feed major river systems, the Tigris, Euphrates, and two others. On a modern map that's hydrologically weird, headwaters don't normally branch out from a single source like spokes on a wheel. Rivers merge as they go down. They don't split and stay big, unless your source is high enough and central enough that multiple drainage basins radiate from around it. In other words, if Eden is conceptualized as a kind of fountainhead on a height, a mountain, a plateau, some elevated navel of the earth, the idea of a single source feeding the beginnings of several rivers becomes more intuitive. Springs flow out on different sides of the massif. Each spring drops into a different valley. Each valley carries that water toward a different river system. That doesn't give you a GPS coordinate, but it shows why later interpreters almost instinctively reimagined Eden as up, and that up meshes perfectly with Judean religious life on the ground. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem is always an ascent. No matter where you start from, in the language of the Psalms you go up to Zion. Pilgrimage songs are literally called songs of ascents. You climb the Judean hills, crest ridge after ridge, and the temple sits near the top of a long spine of uplifted land. For people who have actually made that walk, up is not a metaphor first. It's a bodily memory, thighs burning, breath short. Every step a small elevation gain. Topping the last rise and seeing the city isn't just visually impressive, it's the culmination of a theological movement. You have gone from low to high, from the ordinary zone to the encounter zone. So over time, the Temple Mountain functions as a kind of Eden replacement. The Holy of Holies is the inner garden. The cherubim on the curtain are the guardians at the gate. The altar area is the place of divine human exchange, and the whole complex is perched on a height, a constructed micro-mountain sitting on a natural ridge. Second Temple Jews don't have to spell all that out. They live it several times a year, and a group like the Qumran sect is hearing this language in stereo. On one side, their scriptures talk about Eden as the place where a river rises and flows out to water the world, language that later prophets and poets attached to Zion, to the future temple, to the mountain of the Lord from which living water will flow. On the other side, their lived geography tells them that the way back to God's central dwelling is an uphill walk, literally and figuratively. So you get this layered mental map. Down is distance and danger, up is nearness and protection. The wilderness basin of the Dead Sea is about as down as it gets, geophysically and symbolically. The path of return runs uphill toward Judea's spine and the Temple Mount. Somewhere along that vertical line, at the ideal top, you can imagine Eden. That's where the tension with the rivers becomes productive rather than just confusing. If you insist Eden is a garden in a flat lowland between 4 actual rivers, you have to torture the map or treat the text as sloppy. But if you allow a mountain Eden model, several biblical themes suddenly align. A high place from which waters issue, a sacred centre people ascend to, a vertical axis where heaven's presence touches earth. Eden as a high garden on a holy mountain lets you keep the river imagery and the mountain imagery without forcing them to fight. Some Second Temple writings make this explicit, others just assume it. Texts speak of a mountain of the east or describe future paradise as elevated. Apocalyptic visions climb mountains to get the right vantage point on the world. In 1 Enoch, the seer is led to the centre of the earth, a high place with streams flowing out, an image that many scholars see as an Eden echo. From there, it's a short step to a full sacred elevation tradition, Eden at the primeval top, Zion as the historical stand-in, the eschatological paradise as the perfected summit to which everything is headed. Is that exactly what the authors of Genesis had in mind? We can't prove it. The text itself stays deliberately sparse. But by the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jews are steeped in a world where going up is going Godward, where the most important holy place sits on a mountain, and where origin and destiny are both pictured as life flowing down from a high, pure source. In that world, an upward Eden isn't a wild speculation. It's almost the default template. And once Eden starts climbing, something else happens. Paradise stops being only about where you came from. It starts being about where you're headed, which is exactly what the next layer of clues will press on. Not gold or gems as mere decoration, but as geological hints that Eden's terrain and its mountain metals were always part of the map. If rivers and altitude are one layer of the map, the next layer is glittering. Genesis doesn't just tell you there's a river in Eden. It pauses for what sounds, at first hearing, like a random travel brochure detail. The gold of that land is good. Bdellium and onyx stone are there. Most modern readers hit that line and mentally file it under pretty decorations, nice ambience, divine landscaping. But in the ancient world, you don't drop resource notes like that by accident. Gold and particular stones aren't background colour. They're signals. Start with the obvious. In a subsistence world, mineral wealth is weirdly unnecessary and therefore powerful. You cannot eat gold, you cannot plough with onyx, but if you control the place where those things come out of the ground, you control desire, prestige, and eventually armies. Ancient kings understood this instinctively. In Mesopotamia, royal inscriptions brag not just about conquests, but about building projects. I coated the gate with gold. I inlaid the throne with precious stones. These aren't detailed interior design notes. They're proof that the king sits at the center of a network that can pull rare material from far away and concentrate it in one shining spot. Temple splendor works the same way. Look at how the tabernacle and temple are described later in the Bible. Gold everywhere, gold on the ark, on the lampstand, on the incense altar, hammered gold on the interior walls. Cherubim made of beaten gold, chains of gold, utensils of gold. Precious stones mounted on the high priest's breastpiece, 12 of them, representing the tribes, but also visibly concentrating the land's wealth on one human chest. This isn't random luxury. It's a theological argument in architecture, where God dwells, the best of the earth converges. The true centre of the world is the place where creation's most prized materials are gathered, refined, and dedicated. Now go back to Eden. The author of Genesis puts a quiet flag in the ground. The gold of that land is good, not just exists. It is good, tov, the same word used for light, seas, plants, living creatures. That little adjective tucks metal and stone into the category of things God deliberately approves. So when the text mentions bdellium and onyx, it's not merely saying, this place is pretty. It's hinting that the region around Eden is resource-rich in the very stuff that in later Israelite imagination will scream temple kingship. Sanctuary, Second Temple Jews are primed to hear it that way. By the time you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jerusalem's temple is a memory or an ideal, depending on the date. Either way, its imagined splendour is coated in precious metal and studded with stones. Qumran texts dream of a future sanctuary, with foundations of sapphire and precious stone, echoing prophetic promises, where Zion's walls are set with jewels. These writers don't just think in terms of land and water, they think in terms of ores and gems as signs that a place has been specially ordered, stocked and claimed by God. And their scriptures back this up. In Ezekiel's taunt against the Prince of Tyre, the passage that merges Eden and God's mountain, that primordial figure is adorned with every precious stone. Sardius, topaz, diamond, beryl, onyx, jasper, the list reads like a jeweller's inventory. The image fuses garden, mountain and treasure house all at once. Where God's presence was, the stones clustered. Isaiah, looking forward, imagines a Zion rebuilt with foundations laid in sapphires, battlements of rubies, gates of sparkling jewels. Revelation, much later, will do the same with the New Jerusalem, 12 foundation stones, each a different gem. All of this follows the same instinct. Minerals map holiness. In that mental universe, the Genesis note about good gold is not just scenery. It is either, pay attention, the true sacred centre lies in or near a region known for particular resources, or this is the prototype of all true centres. Wherever God really dwells, the world's treasure naturally flows there. And ancient people absolutely connected geography and resource zones like that. You can see it in how empires form, control the copper of Cyprus, the silver of Anatolia, the bitumen pits along the Dead Sea, and you shape trade routes and tribute patterns. Temple treasuries are not abstract ideals. They are literally built from specific mines, quarries, and trade corridors. So one way to read Genesis 2 is as a kind of mineral map. Maybe the Pishon and Gihon references, now opaque to us, once pointed hearers toward known goldfields or gemstone regions on the fringes of their world. If Eden's surround is associated with that land whose gold everyone knows is good, the text could be quietly anchoring the story near recognizable resource hotspots. That reading treats the resource list almost like an ancient footnote. You know that stretch of territory with the onyx quarries? Yeah, think that direction. But there's another way to read it, and Second Temple writers seem comfortable running both tracks at once. Gold and precious stones are also rhetorical shorthand. They say this is the true centre, whether or not you can draw it on a surveyor's map. You don't need to know exactly where bdellium was mined to feel the force of the claim. Eden is where creation's best concentrates. Later, the temple is where Israel's best concentrates. Finally, the eschatological sanctuary is where the renewed creation's glory concentrates. Qumran's community leans hard into that logic. They see themselves as the sanctuary in the wilderness, the purified core waiting for God to restore the real temple. Some of their texts picture the future house of God in overwhelmingly rich terms, with treasures laid up, priestly garments set with stones, sacred vessels gleaming. The geography they care most about is not just hills and valleys. It's where holiness and value intersect. So when they hear that Eden's land had good gold and precious stones, they can hear at least three overlapping messages. Eden occupied a choice piece of the world's geology. Eden prefigured the temple whose very building materials mirror that description. And any place that dares claim to be God's true centre must somehow match that pattern, if not in literal awe, then in concentrated glory and righteousness. In other words, the minerals are doing double duty. They might preserve a memory of actual resource belts, clues to how the storytellers oriented Eden in their mental map of the world. And at the same time, they function as theological highlighters, marking Eden as the archetype of every later holy centre. Is Genesis inviting you to go prospecting for ancient goldfields? Maybe. Is it staking a claim that paradise is where the real wealth of creation is gathered around God? Almost certainly. Either way, once you stop treating the stones as mere decoration, the Eden story starts sounding less like a children's picture book and more like a sophisticated commentary on power, place, and who gets to say the centre of the world is here. And that raises a sharper question for the scrolls. If Eden's precious materials can mark the true centre, what happens when the same kinds of materials show up in stories about beings who weren't supposed to have that knowledge in places that weren't supposed to be holy? When Second Temple Jews thought about wrong people with the right materials, their minds didn't go first to crooked bankers. They went to the watchers in the Enochic texts, books like 1 Enoch that the Qumran community copied obsessively. The big crisis before the flood is not just human wickedness in the abstract. It's a geographic invasion. Heavenly beings assigned to watch over the world from their proper sphere come down. They don't just visit, they settle, they take wives. They have children, and in the process they teach. Metals, cosmetics, sorcery, root cutting, weaponry. In other words, they unlock the earth. Ore bodies that had been sitting harmlessly in the dark are suddenly turned into blades. Plants that had been food or background greenery are suddenly potions, poisons, and medicines. The knowledge itself is not evil. But in this telling, the timing and the teachers are. This is forbidden knowledge because it crosses a boundary that was supposed to be guarded. And here's where geography starts mutating into mythic territory. Those watchers don't descend into some abstract nowhere. Enoch's story anchors them in the days of Jared and in specific vistas, high mountains, desolate places, valleys that become burial grounds for the giant offspring they produce. Later Enoch sections will walk you through tours of the world, storehouses of wind, chambers of hail, mountains of precious stone, the fiery western edge of the earth. It's like an ancient travelogue of cosmic hotspots. But the key move is that certain stretches of land become marked permanently by what happened there. Mount Hermon, for example, takes its name in Enoch from the oath the watchers swear when they decide to descend. That mountain, in some Jewish imaginations, becomes the place where heaven's guardians broke ranks, a literal ridge of rock turned into a monument to rebellion. Disaster zones become coordinates. The ruins of the giants' cities, the places where their bodies lie bound, the valleys where judgment fire is said to burn to the end of all generations. These locations flicker between map space and story space. You can point at them on a horizon, and you can also point at them in a myth. And once you see that habit of thought, Eden looks different. Genesis 2:3 is already about boundaries. The garden is planted in a wider land. A river separates inside from outside. Humans are told of every tree you may eat, but of this one you may not. Eden is, in miniature, a managed territory with zones, permissions, and no-go areas. In Enoch, that logic goes global. Heaven and earth are supposed to have a hard border. Sacred knowledge is supposed to be released at the right time, through the right channels. Certain mountains are supposed to sit there as markers, not as runways. When those rules are broken, the earth itself is contaminated. Soil cries out. Valleys seethe. City ruins become accusations. Forbidden knowledge is always a boundary violation. And in Second Temple imagination, every boundary has a landscape attached. So connect that back to golden stones. We just saw that Eden's good gold and precious materials can mark a place as legitimately ordered around God. But in Enoch, metals are also the first tools of organized violence and vanity, pushed by beings who circumvent God's timetable. You end up with a double code, stones and metals clustered in the right sanctuary, proof of divine order, stones and metals massed around corrupt powers, fortified cities, giant tyrants, evidence that a zone has been hijacked, and those zones are not neutral. They're battlefields in an ongoing cosmic conflict. Qumran lives in that tension. This is a community that reads Genesis and Enoch side by side. Their copies of 1 Enoch are among the oldest we have. They also preserve Jubilees, which retells Genesis with even stronger boundaries: holy places, holy times, forbidden unions, angels assigned to nations. For them, the world is not just made of hills and rivers. It's parcelled out into jurisdictions. Some mountains are holy of holies. Other mountains are where watchers chained in darkness await judgment. Some wildernesses are where Israel was tested and God spoke. Other wildernesses are where demons and unclean spirits roam, and the line between those categories is not drawn on a GPS map. It's drawn in stories. This is why deserts, mountains and ruins become such potent backdrops in their literature. A desert is never only empty space. It can be the wilderness where God led Israel in a pillar of fire, or the wilderness of the peoples, where nations are gathered for judgment, or the haunt of the spirits spawned by the Watcher's rebellion. A mountain is never just altitude. It's either Zion, the archetypal Eden mountain where God's throne is, or Hermon, the archetypal rebel mountain where heaven came down uninvited. By attaching mythic episodes to real topography, you turn physical travel into moral navigation. Walk toward Jerusalem. You are, in a sense, walking toward Eden, toward ordered presence. Walk towards certain peaks and ruined cities to the north. You are heading into the shadow of the Watchers, into landscapes still remembering their crime. Now notice what that does to Eden itself. Eden can be read two ways in this world, as a protected zone, tightly bordered, where access is strictly controlled, humans expelled, cherubim stationed at the east gate, flaming sword guarding the way back to the Tree of Life. Or as a contested territory in a much wider cosmic chessboard, a primal high place that becomes the template for later holy mountains, surrounded by lands that can be claimed either by God's order or by corrupt powers trying to replicate paradise on their own terms. Qumran's texts lean into that ambiguity rather than solve it. In some hymns and rule documents they talk like a miniature Eden, a purified camp, strict boundaries, angels present in their assemblies, priestly order mirroring a heavenly liturgy. In war texts, the same territory becomes a launch pad in the final cosmic battle, where the sons of light clash with the sons of darkness across specific stretches of land. Is the wilderness around them cursed, like the post-Enoch world, or sanctified, like a new Eden in exile? The answer is both, depending on which story you plug into the map. And that seems intentional. By blurring map space and story space, Qumran writers make every place morally charged. The question is never simply, where are we? It's, which narrative is claiming this ground right now, Eden's ordered abundance, or the Watcher's illicit knowledge and the violence that follows it? When you read Eden through Enochic eyes, the garden stops being an isolated myth and starts looking like the opening move in a long territorial war. A war over who controls access to creation's deepest resources. A war over who decides when and how knowledge is released. A war over which mountains, rivers and deserts count as home turf for God. And that sets up the next move in Second Temple thought. If the world has been carved up like that, with sacred and corrupted zones, how do later writers redraw the map? Where exactly does Eden sit once the earth is divided, measured, and assigned? When you open the book of Jubilees, you're not just getting Genesis with extra footnotes. You're stepping into a world where time and space are put on a grid. Jubilees takes the loose, flowing narrative of Genesis and Exodus and snaps it into fixed intervals, 49-year blocks called Jubilees, subdivided into weeks of years. History becomes a ledger. Events happen on precise dates. Covenants are renewed on scheduled anniversaries. Nothing is random. The same instinct goes for land, where Genesis can feel like a story that happens in places. Jubilees starts to feel like a surveyor's notebook. It's obsessed with divisions. The division of days into appointed times, the division of the law into categories, the division of the earth among Noah's sons and their descendants. The world after the flood is not just repopulated, it's partitioned. In Jubilees, Noah doesn't just float off the ark, build a vineyard and curse Canaan. He becomes a kind of proto-Joshua, overseeing a grand allotment ceremony. The earth is parcelled out to Shem, Ham and Japheth with boundaries, rivers, mountains and coastlines marking who gets what. This is not geography like a travel guide. It's geography like a covenant contract. And buried in that division language is a new way of thinking about Eden. Because once you start dividing the earth into measured lots, every sacred place becomes a coordinate. Every story becomes an anchor point on a mental map. Eden in this system is no longer just somewhere in the east. It's a reference node in a sacred cartography. Jubilees loves the word portion. Israel has a portion. Levi has a portion. The angels have portions. The nations are assigned their own territories under different spiritual rulers. Time itself has portions, holy days, Sabbaths, Jubilees, set apart from ordinary days. By the time you finish the book, you realize nothing is neutral. Everything belongs in a grid of allotted space and allotted time. Now fit Eden into that. If the world is divided after the flood, where does the primeval garden go in the imagination? It doesn't vanish. Instead, it becomes the primal holy portion against which all other portions are measured. Think of Eden as square zero on an invisible coordinate system. Later sanctuaries, Noah's altar, Abraham's promised land, Sinai, Zion, can be understood as attempts to reinscribe that original coordinate into a new divided world. Each covenant moment is a point plotted back toward Eden's axis. Jubilees makes that logic explicit by constantly tying land to covenant identity. Abraham does not just receive vague promises about descendants. He is promised a specific inheritance within the post-flood world map. Israel's territory is not just a nice patch of Mediterranean real estate. It is the Holy Land assigned to them from the foundation of the world, written into Noah's division, watched over by the right angel, associated with the right highland zones and headwaters. In that framework, being God's people means inhabiting God's designated space. Lose the land, and you haven't just been conquered, you've slipped off your correct coordinate. So when Jubilees retells the Eden story, it leans into that sense of measured order. Eden becomes part of a tightly structured history in which sacred times are fixed, sacred spaces are bounded, sacred genealogies are traced to specific territories, which means Eden is not just a place humans once lived and then lost. It's the archetype of how land should be allocated in obedience to God, boundaries respected, access regulated, holiness concentrated in a central zone. You can see why this would matter to a community like Qumran. They're living in a Roman-dominated world where imperial maps say one thing about who owns what. Jubilees hands them an older rival map. On that map, the nations are where they are because God divided them that way. Angels oversee domains. Israel's strip of land is non-negotiable because it was marked out before empires even existed. And Eden is the proof of concept that such ordered space once functioned perfectly. Notice how abstract this can get while still feeling intensely geographic. Jubilee's world isn't accurate in the way a modern atlas is accurate. Coastlines might be fuzzy, river systems idealized, distances more symbolic than measured. But readers still experience it as geography because it's structured like a map. Regions, borders, north, south, east, west, mountains and rivers forming natural lines. You don't have to be able to walk it with a GPS for it to feel like actual land. Schematic maps work like that today. Think of a subway diagram, distorted distances, straight lines where tracks actually curve, but it tells you how the system is ordered, where lines intersect, which stations matter, how you move from one zone to another. Jubilees is giving you a subway map of sacred history. Lines of genealogy intersect with lines of land division. Certain stations, Eden, Ararat, Zion, Sinai, become transfer points where heaven and earth, angel and human, time and place intersect. Once you see Eden on that kind of diagram, it changes what the story is doing. The garden becomes the first station where time, land and law line up, a fixed rhythm of days, a bounded territory marked off from the wider earth. A command about a tree that functions like the first Torah. You may not. In Jubilee's mindset, that pattern doesn't disappear when Adam and Eve are expelled. It gets repeated and scaled. Sabbath is the weekly echo of Eden's ordered time. The promised land is the territorial echo of Eden's bounded space. The law given at Sinai is the textual echo of Eden's first command. End times restoration, then, is not just about going back to the garden emotionally. It's about God reimposing the right divisions on a world that has been mispartitioned. Nations sitting in lands that aren't their true allotment. That's a problem to be fixed, angels ruling territories they were not assigned. That's a cosmic violation. Israel scattered among the nations instead of dwelling in its inherited portion. That's a temporary disruption that the final Jubilee will undo. Eden in that vision is the calibration point. The Qumran community reads Jubilees and sees themselves as living in a wrong arrangement that is about to be righted. Their camp in the desert tries to function as a corrected micro-portion, holy time, holy space, holy people, anticipating the moment when the whole earth is redrawn according to the original template. And under that template, Eden is not a mystery location you dig for with a shovel. It's a reference coordinate that organizes the whole conversation about nations, borders, and destinies. You can almost hear the implied question behind their maps and calendars. Which division of the world are you living by? Rome's fluid empire-friendly map, or Noah's and Jubilees' fixed allotments, with Eden as the silent origin point? Once that question is on the table, Eden stops being mainly about nostalgia and starts being about jurisdiction. Who has the right to draw the lines? And that tension pushes straight into the next step in Second Temple thought. If Eden is the original coordinate, and the land is misallocated now, what does a fully restored map look like, especially for a community that believes the end of the age is around the corner? Once you start asking what a fully restored map looks like, Eden quietly slides into the background and a new word moves to the front of the stage: paradise. In Greek, paradisos is just a walled garden, a park. But in Second Temple Jewish imagination, it becomes something else, a way of talking about Eden shifted forward in time. Eden is then, paradise is later. That distinction sounds technical, but it changes how people think about land. In the early biblical stories, the garden is a past reality. Humans were there, got expelled, and now live east of it. The direction is always away, cherubim block the return path. There's no realistic expectation that you can jog back in with the right coordinates and a machete. By the time you get to later prophets and Second Temple texts, the emotional compass flips. Instead of asking, where was the garden? People start asking, where will paradise open up? The axis of hope moves from memory to expectation. You see that shift first in the restoration prophecies themselves. Isaiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Zechariah, they don't spend a lot of time narrating what Eden used to look like. They use Eden as a reference image for what the world will look like when God finally fixes it. And the way they picture that fix is through landscape healing. Think about the themes that keep repeating. Water shows up where it shouldn't. Trees explode into life in places that are dead. Soils that are cursed with thorns suddenly produce grain, vines and fruit. Isaiah has deserts bursting into bloom, wilderness, turning into a well-watered garden, streams in the Negeb, pools in the scorched land. Ezekiel 47 describes a trickle of water flowing from the temple threshold that becomes a mighty river, making the Dead Sea fresh and filling its shores with trees, whose leaves heal and fruits never fail. Joel takes the same logic and localizes it. Mountains dripping with new wine, hills flowing with milk, all of Judah watered by a fountain that goes out from God's house. Zechariah pictures living waters flowing out from Jerusalem, one stream to the eastern sea, one to the western, summer and winter alike. None of this is travel brochure language. It's Eden language turned forward. The prophets don't say, let's go find that old garden. They say, in effect, when God acts, this ravaged, misallocated land will start behaving like Eden did. Paradise is not a museum exhibit of the past. It's an upgrade of the present. Second Temple writers inherit that restoration imagery and start to systematize it. By the time you're reading 1 Enoch, 4 Ezra, 2 Baruch, the idea of paradise has splintered into a few overlapping strands. Sometimes it's a hidden current realm where righteous souls go after death, often located in the east or in the third heaven. Sometimes it's a renewed earthly zone that appears at the end, when God levels mountains, raises valleys, and rebuilds Zion. But the common thread is timing. Paradise belongs to the coming age. That's crucial for how geography works. If Eden is anchored in primordial time, you're tempted to hunt it on a present map. Some mountain in Armenia, some valley in Mesopotamia, some fertile crescent between named rivers. People have been doing that for centuries, but if paradise is primarily future, the cartographic pressure drops. You don't have to pinpoint a lost garden's coordinates. You have to identify the starting point of transformation. In other words, where does the healing begin? The scrolls are saturated with that expectation. The Qumran community isn't just mapping the world as it is, they are living as if the world is about to flip into its final configuration. The desert around them is not permanent wasteland. It's a staging ground. Texts like the Community Rule and the War Scroll describe the group as a way in the wilderness, a purified camp preparing the highway for God's return. The land is under defilement now, occupied by wrong rulers and polluted cults, but any day the boundaries could be redrawn. When that happens, they do not imagine God teleporting them into some sealed-off celestial garden far away. They picture their own landscape changing character. Wilderness becomes garden. Dead waters become living. The holy portion is re-centered, and everything else is judged relative to it. You can feel the same logic in their exegesis of prophetic rivers and trees. When a Qumran reader hears Ezekiel talk about a river from the temple making salty water fresh, or Isaiah promising that the desert will blossom like a rose, they don't hear abstract poetry. They hear a field report in advance. Their eschatology is geographic, and that geography is less about recovering a past Eden than about watching for where paradise will erupt. That shift solves a quiet problem that's been hanging over all these discussions. If nobody in antiquity could actually agree on Eden's location, what were they doing with all those place names? One answer is, they were reinterpreting them prophetically. A river that goes out from Eden can become the model for rivers that will go out from Zion. A mountain that once sheltered a garden can become the prototype for the mountain of God in the last days. Eastward can signal exile now and homecoming later, depending on which side of the story you're standing on. In that lens, a lot of the geographical clues aren't GPS tags for where humanity began. They're fault lines for where renewal is expected to start. The spring that waters the garden becomes the archetype for the spring that will break out under the temple. The four rivers that once divided the earth become shadows of the living waters that will flow to the four corners of the world. The fertile land in the midst of the nations becomes the centre from which a healed earth is administered. Second Temple thought doesn't erase Eden, it stretches it. The primeval garden becomes the template, paradise is the rollout. And once you see that, the scroll's intense interest in their specific patch of land makes more sense. Qumran isn't just hiding until God airlifts them to a different universe. They are staking a claim that the very ground under their feet is going to be rewritten according to the Eden template. Their maps, their calendars, their purity rules, they're all early adoption of paradise geography. Which means when they read Genesis and the prophets for where Eden is, they're not only thinking backwards. They're tracing the coordinates forward, asking, where will the lines be corrected first? Where will the waters break out? Where will the first patch of earth start behaving like the garden again? Under that eschatological pressure, the quest to locate Eden on a present map starts to look like the wrong question. The better question, the one the scrolls quietly push us toward, is, can you recognize the Eden pattern when it starts reappearing, not behind you in prehistory, but in front of you, as the first contours of paradise. And if you can, what does that do to a place like the Dead Sea, a body of water so toxic and lifeless that it seems designed to be the foil against which any future river of life will shine? If you were going to stage a contrast between what the world is and what the world will be when Eden logic returns, you could hardly pick a better prop than the Dead Sea. Everything about it screams anti-garden. Nothing lives in it besides microbes. No fish, no reeds, no frogs along the edges at night. The water is so saturated with minerals that it burns your eyes and lips. If you somehow tried to irrigate with it, you'd just salt your land to death. In the ancient world, that wasn't just an oddity. It was a symbol. Salt in the Bible isn't only about flavour and covenant. It's what you throw on a field you want to curse. Deuteronomy and Judges talk about salting a destroyed city so nothing grows there again. Lot's wife turns into a pillar of salt overlooking this valley of judgment. Prophets describe overturned cities as places where brimstone and salt cover the ground, where no grass can sprout. Stand on those cliffs above the Dead Sea, and you're looking at a live-action picture of all of that. Water that doesn't give life. Shorelines where almost nothing grows. A basin associated in Israelite memory with cities that were so corrupt God rained fire on them. If Eden is this super fertile, well-watered, tree-lined environment where rivers go out to bless the earth, the Dead Sea Basin is almost a photographic negative, which is exactly why it becomes so useful in prophetic imagination. Notice where some of the most famous healing waters prophecies are aimed. Ezekiel 47 doesn't have the Temple River just meander through some generic landscape. It flows east, it descends into the Arabah. It hits what he explicitly calls the sea, whose waters are healed, and suddenly fishermen are spreading their nets along its shores. For an ancient Judean, there's really only one sea east of Jerusalem down in the Rift Valley, whose problem is that nothing can live in it. The Dead Sea is the problem case. It's the control experiment. If living water can make that fresh, the prophet is saying it can fix anything. Zechariah's living waters split, some flowing eastward, some westward. Joel's fountain goes out from the house of the Lord and waters the valley of acacias. Isaiah keeps hammering the idea that the most barren zones, the desert, the parched land, the scorched steppe, are going to host pools, rivers, trees. Read those together with a map in mind, and a pattern emerges. The prophets aren't dreaming about God relocating people into a pristine, untouched garden somewhere out there. They're obsessed with the most damaged, least promising landscapes they know and saying, "Watch this space." From Qumran, that space is not theoretical. It's literally the basin you're staring at every time you walk out of the cave. Lifeless water, salt flats, heat that makes stone crack. Imagine being a community that thinks in Eden language, reads Ezekiel and Isaiah constantly, and has chosen to live right there on the shore of what looks like the anti-garden. It does something to your imagination. First, it intensifies longing. When you pray psalms about rivers, trees, and green pastures, while the wind blows dust and salt into your face, the gap between promise and reality is painfully obvious. You can't sentimentalize desert blooming when you know exactly how dead this desert is. Second, it sharpens your sense of contrast. Eden isn't just a nice image from the past. It's the opposite of what you see out your window. Every time the scrolls talk about waters of impurity, torrent of fire, wilderness of the peoples, they're drawing from a lived vocabulary of hostile landscape. Eden language, by contrast, becomes code for everything this valley is not yet. That yet is crucial. One interpretive possibility, which makes a lot of sense once you put Qumran on the map, is that some of these writers aren't simply contrasting there and here, past garden and present wasteland. They're layering those stories so that the Eden template hovers over the Dead Sea region itself. Not in the sense of, see, the Garden of Genesis was literally located at this salty lake, and we can triangulate the 4 rivers from here. More like, this is the place where the anti-Eden will be reversed. The site of judgment is going to become the test case for restoration. In that view, the Dead Sea is less the opposite of Eden, and more the before picture of it. The prophets help you get there. Ezekiel's river doesn't bypass the cursed sea. It targets it. The text makes a point of saying that the swamps and marshes are left for salt, as if the only thing that ought to remain of the old curse is a boundary marker, a reminder. Everything else, from En-Gedi to En-Eglaim, turns into a habitat for life. That's not random geography. Those are actual place names on the western shore, within hiking distance of where the scrolls were later copied. If you live at Qumran, you can practically stand between En-Gedi and the Dead Sea and read Ezekiel out loud like a future weather report. Now drop Eden into that frame. Instead of treating Genesis 2 as a set of GPS coordinates, you have to match to some Mesopotamian delta. Imagine those early rivers and trees as the master plan. The pattern. The way God wants land and water to behave. Genesis gives you the schematic. The prophets tell you where it will get built out. For Second Temple readers on the margin of the Dead Sea, those lines could reasonably intersect on their horizon. So Eden becomes, in part, a way of talking about what this ecological disaster zone is destined to become when the curse is finally rolled back. That doesn't mean the garden really was at Qumran. The scrolls don't give you a tourist brochure saying, "Welcome to the original paradise, now under renovation." They preserve multiple traditions that point Eden elsewhere, up in the north, in cosmic mountains, in heaven itself. The Dead Sea reading is not a literal location claim. It's a deliberate, rhetorical contrast. This is the worst water we know. This is the most judged land we can point to. If this turns into something Eden-like, the whole earth is in play. In that sense, the Dead Sea functions the way East of Eden does in Genesis. It's where exile is dramatized. The Qumran community is sitting in an exile land and betting that exile is about to be reversed, not by escaping to a hidden garden, but by watching their blighted landscape start to imitate Eden, which sets up a bigger, more uncomfortable question for us. If ancient writers could look at a place like the Dead Sea and say, this is anti-Eden now, but Eden logic is going to rewrite it, then maybe we've been reading Eden clues too flatly. Maybe some of the geography in Genesis and the prophets is less about pinning the past and more about daring to name the ugliest spots on the map as the first candidates for transformation. And once empires get involved, drawing new borders, redirecting trade routes, exploiting or ignoring these marginal zones, that daring reading of Eden starts to collide with very practical, very political maps. Once empires start laying grids over landscapes, maps stop being just where things are and start becoming how power thinks the world fits together. By the time the Dead Sea Scrolls are being copied, Judea has lived under 3 huge mapping projects in a row: Persian, Hellenistic, and Roman. Each one comes with its own way of imagining space, and that seeps into how people hear words like river, east, and even earth. Under the Persians, the biblical world is folded into something enormous, an empire that runs from the Aegean to the Indus. Persian royal inscriptions brag about this side of the river and the other side of the river, with the Euphrates as a kind of macro border. For Judeans, that river stops being just a remote Mesopotamian landmark. It becomes a line in the imperial bureaucracy. Taxes, military garrisons, provincial boundaries beyond the river is a category stamped on documents, not just a line on a map. Then come the Greeks with their geographers and philosophers. They don't just list places, they start arranging them. You get ideas about a single oikoumene, an inhabited world, ringed by oceans, sliced by major rivers, named and theorized. Alexander's campaigns don't just conquer cities, they link trade routes, pull information together, spread Greek place names and coordinate systems from Egypt to Central Asia. By the 1st century BCE, educated elites all across the eastern Mediterranean have some version of this mental atlas. They may disagree on details, but they share a sense that there is a world, singular, that can be sketched as a whole. Not just our land and whatever lies beyond the hills, but a connected network of seas, rivers and peoples. Rome takes that and militarizes it. Roman roads, Roman milestones, Roman itineraries. These don't just help legions move, they reshape how distance is felt. Suddenly, people can talk about how far it is from Antioch to Jerusalem in days of march, how long a courier takes to ride from Damascus to Caesarea. Ports like Seleucia, Alexandria, and Puteoli aren't just names. They're nodes in an empire-scale web of grain, taxes, troops. Now drop ancient Judean scriptures into that environment. If you're a scribe in this world, copying texts that talk about the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, you're not working with a blank mental slate. The Euphrates is not some distant mystery, it's the spine of imperial administration. The Tigris sits inside a province you've heard of. Mesopotamia is no longer just where our ancestors once went into exile. It's integrated into the same world system that sends spices from Arabia and grain from Egypt. In that setting, famous rivers become more than local memories. They become symbolic anchors. Think about how we use Silk Road today. We don't mean a single dirt track, we mean a whole fuzzy network of routes, ideas and exchanges between East and West. The word condenses a geography that sprawls across half a continent. Ancient writers did the same with certain rivers. Euphrates can name one physical stream, but it can also stand for an entire frontier zone, a whole slice of the world where empires meet. Nile is not just the water in Egypt. It's shorthand for the richest agricultural machine under the sun. Gihon and Kush together evoke lands far south and east, beyond normal horizons. When Genesis says a river goes out of Eden, splits into 4 heads, and one of those skirts all the land of Kush, another winds around Havilah with its gold, another flows east of Ashur, and another is the Euphrates. That sounds less like a local survey and more like a rhetorical reach. It's as if the author is saying, from this source, the whole world you've heard of gets watered. Now imagine scribes and teachers reading that after centuries of Persian, Hellenistic and Roman rule. They're used to imperial maps where a few lines, Nile, Euphrates, Halys, Danube, carry absurd amounts of meaning. Those rivers divide satrapies, mark campaign routes, define this side and the other side. Why wouldn't they hear the Eden rivers that way too? They might not assume we can stand at point X and see all 4 riverheads. Instead, they could hear this place is conceptually upstream of everything that matters. It's the spiritual headwaters of the whole imperial world. That's one reason later Second Temple texts like Jubilees love to talk about how the earth is divided among Noah's sons with boundaries running along great rivers and seas. They're not just playing with mythology, they're mirroring the way imperial decrees already carve up space. The planet is imagined as a set of allotments separated by famous watercourses, cosmic satrapies if you like. Scribes can then plug Eden into that circuitry. Name-dropping the Tigris and Euphrates automatically pulls in the Mesopotamian arm of the world. Mentioning Kush gestures toward African or southern zones. Talking about Havilah links in desert fringes and gold routes that traders actually use. One short paragraph becomes a mental atlas. North, south, east, west. Resource-rich lands, border rivers, caravan corridors. And this isn't just clever word choice. It's a way of saying Eden's logic is not parochial. For a community sitting by the Dead Sea, on what feels like the fringe of everything, this matters. On one hand, their daily horizon is brutally local. Cliffs, salt flats, one cursed lake. On the other hand, every time a caravan passes on the main north-south route in the Jordan Valley, they're reminded that Rome's world is huge and interconnected. News, coins, languages, and commodities move through this narrow corridor. So when they hear about a garden whose rivers go out and touch the big names of the map, they can easily hold two things at once. Eden is like a pattern hovering over their own devastated basin, a promise that this specific anti-garden will be healed. But Eden is also mapped onto the Imperial world's major arteries, as if God's source river is ultimately behind the Nile floods, the Euphrates irrigation, the far-off lands of Cush and Havilah. The same story gestures from their shoreline all the way out to the limits of their mental map. Empire-era mapping habits make that kind of double vision almost inevitable. On the surface, Eden sounds global. Its waters reach to every direction you know, every famous region on the scroll of your imagination. At the same time, it can sound very specific, tethered to the actual rivers and routes that armies march along and merchants sail through. That tension, global and particular, cosmic and cartographic at once, is exactly what makes Eden so slippery to pin down and so powerful to think with. It might also be why later readers keep arguing about it. If you're used to modern maps, you instinctively want to choose. Either Eden is a literal spot somewhere near these rivers, or it's just mythic language. But for ancient writers shaped by imperial geographies, those options weren't mutually exclusive. A place could be real and enlarged, local and world-sized at the same time. Which leaves us with a problem. If the Eden story is already carrying the weight of Persian satrapies, Greek world maps, and Roman trade routes, then any attempt to locate it that ignores those mental atlases is going to flatten what's going on. It turns a multi-layered symbol anchored in imperial space into a treasure hunt on Google Earth. To move past that, we have to ask a different kind of question. Not just, where would you have to stand to see four rivers, but how would a second temple scribe, living under empires, use river names and border terms to say, this story is about the whole world without sounding abstract? And that brings us straight into another blind spot. How much of our problem with Eden comes down to the way we've translated and harmonized these texts, squeezing imperial era nuance into modern categories they were never written for? A huge part of the problem starts long before anybody opens a Dead Sea Scroll or a modern atlas. It starts in the moment a translator has to pick a single English word for an ancient term that was doing far more work than our word can carry. Take garden. When most people hear Garden of Eden, they don't picture a highland sanctuary, or a walled royal park fed by engineered channels, or a cosmic source zone that maps onto the whole known world. They see something much more specific: green lawn, fruit trees, tame animals, maybe a white couple with strategically placed foliage. That image didn't drop out of the sky. It's been reinforced for centuries by paintings, children's Bibles, stained glass, and sermons. Once that visual stereotype is in place, the word garden becomes a trap. It quietly decides the question before we even start reading. But the Hebrew term gan doesn't have to mean a small backyard with tomatoes and roses. It can mean an enclosed park, a royal estate, a planted zone attached to a palace or a temple. In the ancient Near East, those gardens were often irrigation projects on the edge of arid land, sustained by carefully managed water. In other words, the word itself sits right on the border between agriculture, architecture, and theology. Translate it flatly as garden. In a culture where garden means suburban lawn, and you've already chopped off half its mental geography. You've told people, think private yard, not imperial landscape. Think morality play, not hydrology and borders. The same thing happens with east. In Hebrew, east is tied to the word for front or before. It can be a direction, but it can also function like upstream in a river system, or toward sunrise, which is not the same as a neat compass bearing. When Genesis says humans are driven east of Eden, that can cue a cluster of ideas, away from the sanctuary, toward the wild steppe, toward exile lands. English just gives you east, which in our heads is a clean arrow on a map. So we flatten what was once a thick bundle of orientation metaphors into a single line. Do that enough times, garden, east, earth, river, land, and you end up with a text that looks like a simple story about two people in a park who broke a rule. The spatial logic gets pushed to the background if it's noticed at all. And once the story's main job becomes explain why humans sin, readers stop asking geographical questions. Moral logic gets privileged over spatial logic almost automatically. If Eden is mainly about temptation, disobedience and punishment, then who cares exactly what the Pishon is, or where Haviloh's gold lies? Those become obscure trivia for textual nerds, not key clues in the story's architecture. That shift in priorities does something subtle but powerful. It trains generations of readers, preachers and translators to treat the geographic details as optional window dressing instead of structural beams. So when you get to the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they start playing with rivers, mountains, east-west movement, and temple spaces, most people are still wearing morality tail goggles. They will notice ethical warnings, purity rules, and apocalyptic judgment. They will miss that the same texts are obsessively mapping borders, allotments, wilderness corridors and sacred highlands in ways that talk directly back to Eden. Then add a second layer of distortion, the fragmentary nature of the scrolls themselves. Our actual artifacts from Qumran are often little shreds of leather and papyrus. Lines break in mid-sentence, sections are missing. Editorial notes in modern editions chop texts into numbered columns and fragments. Scholars have to specialize just to keep up with one document, the Temple Scroll, or one Enoch, or Jubilees. Articles get written on Eden in Jubilees, or Paradise in one Enoch, but the wider pattern across the whole library is harder to see. It's like trying to understand a subway system by staring at one torn-up station map. You can spend years reconstructing every detail of that one platform and never realize how it connects to 5 different lines. So even when the scrolls are screaming Eden logic through their geography, mountains of God, rivers of life, eastward exile, desert highways, those echoes stay siloed in separate subfields. Very few people are paid to stand back and say, wait, these pieces all belong to the same mental map. Modern assumptions pile on top of that. We bring anachronistic maps into the conversation without even noticing. We think in terms of global projections, GPS coordinates, satellite imagery. We imagine the author of Genesis as someone secretly trying to give us latitude and longitude. If we can just match 4 rivers on a modern map, we'll pin down Eden like a lost city. That's anachronistic in 2 directions. First, it assumes ancient writers were working with the same kind of geometric cartography we are, instead of with symbolic route-based and border-anchored ways of imagining space. Second, it forces a choice they weren't making. Either the text is a literal map of a real spot, or it's just symbolism and nothing in it ever corresponded to physical geography. That literalism versus symbolism showdown is a modern invention. It's the product of post-Enlightenment debates over science and faith, not of Persian-era scribal habits. For Second Temple writers, a place could be both, a real Highland sanctuary where actual people went, and also the archetypal mountain of God that structures how you think about all holy space. a specific river valley you could travel to, and also the conceptual headwaters behind every life-giving watercourse in your world. They didn't need to pick, we do, and our forced choice short-circuits the very nuance that makes their geography powerful. So, when we line up our modern maps, our English translations, our garden paintings, and our is it literal or symbolic arguments, it's not surprising that nobody connects all the clues. We have, in effect, retranslated Eden out of the very mental geography that produced it. The scrolls are one of the best chances we have to reverse that. They let us eavesdrop on a community that still thought in terms of sacred mountains, world-dividing rivers, eastward exile routes, and desert highways back to God. They show us how Eden-like language gets plugged into temple blueprints, cosmic land grants, and apocalyptic itineraries. In the next section, we're going to do what most readings never attempt. We'll take all these scattered hints, the Temple Mountain model, the Source River model, the World Allotment model, and lay them on the same second temple mental map, the one shaped by empires, rituals, and border obsessions. Not to finally find Eden like a buried ruin, but to recover 3 plausible ways ancient readers might have located it in their heads, in their landscape, in their scriptures, and in their future. So let's lay the cards on the table. If you take the scrolls seriously as evidence for how some ancient Jews were actually thinking, you don't end up with Eden was here, X degrees north, Y degrees east. You end up with 3 overlapping mental models. 3 ways of locating Eden that keep showing up in different combinations. Think of them as 3 lenses. None is the answer. But each one brings certain details into focus and explains why the geography in Genesis, Ezekiel, Jubilees, and the Qumran texts is so stubbornly weird. Model 1. Eden as temple cosmos. In this frame, Eden is not mainly a green park. It's a ritual space that orders reality. The temple does in stone what Eden did in story. It draws a line between holy and common, inside and outside, life and death. The scrolls are obsessed with this. Qumran's authors write temple blueprints as if they were cosmology. Gate dimensions, priestly rotations, sacrificial calendars, these aren't mere admin details. They're the architecture of the universe. When they talk about the sanctuary of Adam or about priests serving in a heavenly temple, they're tapping the same current. The idea that there once was a perfect liturgical space where creation and creator met without friction, and that the earthly temple is a controlled recreation of that zone. Read Genesis through that lens, and a bunch of stuff that felt random gets a new logic. The rivers in Eden don't just water trees, they echo the water systems that run through royal and temple grounds. The cherubim with a flaming sword at the east of the garden behave a lot like temple guardians, blocking unauthorized entry. Adam serving and guarding the garden uses verbs later used for priests. What this model explains really well is the tight bond between Eden and temple language in the scrolls and later Jewish tradition. Why Jubilees talks about holy places created from the beginning. Why 1 Enoch imagines heavenly sanctuaries with rivers of life. Why Qumran describes its own community as a kind of substitute temple in the wilderness. But it also leaves some pieces wobbling. If Eden is basically Temple 1.0, why do we get that stubborn 4-river world map? Why does Genesis insist on naming far-flung lands and resources? Why is there so much directional logic eastward, outside, wandering, that sounds like actual geography, not just liturgy? That's where Model 2 comes in. Model 2, Eden as elevated source region. Here, Eden isn't a pixel-precise dot, but it is spatial. It's a high-ground source zone, a place where waters rise and the world's life flows out from a single elevated hub. The scrolls help you see this, because they keep pairing Mountain of God with rivers, springs, and allotment borders. One Enoch's visionary tours go up to mountains where waters and winds are stored. Jubilees divides the earth from an elevated vantage point, handing out continents from a central holy zone. Qumran hymns dream about water in the desert, streams in the steppe, as if restoring a once normal cosmic hydrology. Now go back to Genesis. A river goes out from Eden and is divided into 4 heads. That sounds less like a garden pond and more like a headwaters region. The mention of gold, bdellium and onyx in Havilah sounds like the Highland resource belts ancient people actually mapped in their heads. Stones, ores, rare products that signal source lands, not river deltas. Under this model, Eden is a symbolic but real region, a sacred highland watershed that anchors your picture of the world. You might not be able to sail to it, but it structures how you think about where fertility, wealth, and divine presence come from. This explains the 4 rivers puzzle better than the pure temple model. It matches how Second Temple texts talk about cosmic mountains, source springs, and border rivers. It also makes sense of all that Eastward talk as movement away from the headwaters into drier, riskier lands. What's hard for this model is the garden temple detail. Where do priests, cherubim, and liturgy fit in a mountain watershed map? Why does Ezekiel's future temple have water flowing from it like a mini Eden if Eden wasn't temple-like to begin with? That tension pushes you into the 3rd lens, Model 3, Eden as future restoration zone. This is where geography becomes prophecy in motion. For Qumran and other Second Temple writers, paradise isn't just back there at the beginning, it's ahead. The world will be reordered, deserts will bloom, dead waters will be healed, Gentile allotments will shrink or shift, Israel's land will be purified and expanded. The scrolls talk about a way in the wilderness being prepared, about God's glory appearing in the desert, about rivers and trees in places that are currently dust and salt. In that imagination, Eden is not only an origin story, it's a template for the end. Ezekiel's vision of a new temple with a river that turns the Dead Sea fresh becomes a blueprint. Jubilees' careful mapping of Israel's boundaries, tied to heavenly tablets, becomes a claim about where God's paradise zone will be recentered. Qumran, placing itself on the edge of the Dead Sea, in a region that reads like anti-Eden, becomes a dramatic staging. We are living at ground zero of the future reversal. Under this model, the question, where is Eden, becomes, where will Eden reappear when God fixes the map? And the answer is, in and around the land God has chosen, especially in places that are currently broken, bitter, or cursed. This lens does a great job explaining why so many paradise texts in the scrolls and related literature are future tense, why they keep mixing language about primordial rivers and trees with talk of final judgment, restored Zion and healed seas, why geography shows up as promise language. This mountain, this river, this desert track will be transformed. What it doesn't really solve is the nostalgia. If Eden is mostly future, why does so much effort go into anchoring it in old rivers and ancient resources? Why the Genesis-level insistence on a once-real arrangement of land and water? That's the point where you realize you probably can't pick just one model and be done. The scrolls don't. They slide between them. Sometimes Eden is liturgical, a temple-like zone of pure service. Sometimes it's hydrological, a headwaters region that orients the world. Sometimes it's eschatological, the target state God is steering history back toward, in very specific places. And sometimes all 3 are stacked on the same coordinates. A holy mountain where God's presence dwells, from which fresh water flows, located in or near the land that will be restored at the end. That's the composite picture sitting behind a lot of Second Temple Eden talk. We can't prove exactly how anyone scribe at Qumran imagined it. We don't have their sketch of the world. What we do have are textual habits, the way they continually link temples, mountains, rivers, borders, and future hope. Those habits suggest that when they heard Eden, they weren't picturing a tiny walled orchard. They were reaching for a whole package of ideas about how space, holiness, and history fit together. So instead of hunting for GPS coordinates, it may be more accurate to say Eden lived as a set of overlapping models in their heads. A temple cosmos that orders reality, an elevated source region that feeds the world, a future restoration zone where all of that will be made visible again. Hold those three in view, and suddenly the scattered clues from Genesis, Ezekiel, Jubilees, 1 Enoch, and the Qumran scrolls start to look less like contradictions and more like different angles on the same imagined world. So where does that leave us the next time someone casually drops the phrase, Garden of Eden? It means you don't have to be rude and jump in with, well, actually, but you also don't have to stay stuck with the flannel graph picture of a tiny walled park with a fruit tree and 2 naked people. You can hold something richer in your head. When you hear Eden, you can quietly ask, are we talking about a border, a source, a temple, or a future landscape? Is this person using Eden as a metaphor for intimacy with God inside a sacred space? That's the temple cosmos lens. Are they picturing a Highlands source region where waters, wealth, and life flow outward to the rest of the world? That's the elevated Headwaters lens. Are they pointing toward a not yet, deserts blooming, dead waters healed, the world's map redrawn at the end? That's the restoration lens. Once you start listening for that, you'll notice people mixing them all the time, past and future, garden and mountain, rivers and altars, often without realizing how deeply that blend is rooted in the same Second Temple habits we've been tracking through the scrolls. That's what I meant in the title when I said the Eden that wasn't a garden. It's not that the Bible never pictures trees, fruit, or cultivated space. Those images are real and important. The critique is of the shrunken mental image where Eden is only a cosy little orchard, floating free of rivers, borders, mountains, and temples. The scrolls push back against that flat picture. They make it harder to talk about Eden without also talking about how the world is structured, how holiness is zoned, where water comes from, and where history is going. So next time you hear Garden of Eden, try a small experiment. Mentally zoom out. Ask yourself, if this was on a map, where would the water be coming from? What borders would it be marking? What kind of temple space would it correspond to? And is this being described as something lost behind us, or something still ahead of us? That tiny shift in how you listen can turn a familiar phrase into a live question. Speaking of where things are on the map, I'd love to hear from you again. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there right now. It's always fascinating to see this little community stretched across the world's time zones while we talk about ancient ones. And if you've made it this far, you probably know what I'm going to say next. But it really does matter. If this kind of deep dive into ancient texts, geography, and deep time is your thing, hit like, leave a comment, and subscribe. That's the stuff that tells the algorithm there are actually humans out there who care about this material. If you want to go further, this episode connects to a lot of what I unpack in my book on the 12 prehistoric secrets hiding in the Bible's earliest layers, where bottlenecks, climate shocks, and forgotten landscapes sit behind familiar stories. You can read more about it, or grab a copy on the website. I'll leave a link in the description. I'll leave you with one open question to keep turning over. Given everything we've seen from Genesis to Ezekiel, from Jubilees and 1 Enoch to the Dead Sea Scrolls, which Eden model actually fits the evidence that struck you most? Temple cosmos, elevated source region, future restoration zone, or some hybrid that you're now seeing for the first time? Let me know your answer in the comments, and pay attention in the coming week to how often Eden shows up in conversations, songs, sermons, or books. You might find that once you stop assuming it was only a garden, the whole landscape of the story starts to open up.